Welcome to Frazier and Deeter's Culture of Compliance podcast series, where we discuss compliance as a competitive advantage in today's marketplace. I'm Sabrina Serafin, partner and national leader of Frazier and Deeter's process, risk, and governance practice. Today we're talking to Linh Truong of GoldSRD. Linh is an executive advisor and professional speaker focusing on various topics including agile auditing, corporate governance, enterprise risk management, and assessing corporate culture. She has more than 25 years of audit experience, including serving as a chief audit executive. Linh, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Linh, when we were chatting before the show, we thought this would be a great time to talk about Agile Audit because so many of the traditional ways internal audit has operated has been disrupted. Could you talk a bit about what has happened this year for internal audit teams from your perspective?
Yes, absolutely. So internal auditors, along with everyone else within the entire organization, all functions and departments, are having to address so many disruptions all at once, many of which were unforeseen, right? Many of us are, or some of us may be fortunate enough to experience one black swan event in our lifetimes, but in the past few months, we are all experiencing multiple black swans, from a pandemic to economic crisis, resulting from that, civil unrest. And at the same time, we are losing our resources, or our resources are being cut. And we're experiencing having to deal with all these additional challenges with less resources. So it's a double, triple whammy.
So let's set the stage a bit. When you say agile, what are the basic premises of an agile audit for our audience?
So Agile is a project management methodology that was originally used in software development projects, but it really can be applied to any type of project. So Agile software development is an umbrella term for a set of frameworks and practices based on 4 Agile manifesto values and 12 principles. Now, we can't cover them all here, but some of the key principles which can be applied to our approach to auditing include, first of all, collaboration with key stakeholders. Secondly, prioritizing activities that add value and minimize or even eliminate steps that don't add value. And finally, delivering frequently and more timely by conducting smaller increments of a larger project or an audit, which allows us to communicate observations and recommendations on a real-time basis, rather than waiting until the end of a long audit cycle to deliver our results to our clients. So by focusing our audit efforts only on the areas that will have the most impact, we can scope our audits into smaller increments, small projects that enable us to pivot and adapt quickly to our rapidly changing risk environment if we need to. So just imagine going from a 2-month, which is traditional, what a traditional audit typically takes, a 2-month audit to a 2 to 3 week audit where we are communicating results on a weekly, if not daily basis. This allows us to end our current audit very quickly or wrap it up very quickly, to redirect our resources to a completely different audit if we need to, right? If a new and emerging risk pops up somewhere else.
Linh, you mentioned earlier a black swan event. And in the midst of all of the other issues and changes that we're having to deal with this year, what questions should a chief audit executive ask if he or she is thinking about shifting to an agile approach?
So first and foremost, before any leader decides to undertake any sort of transformative change to their organization or for their organization, they need to first ask whether the company's culture can sustain that kind of transformation. They also need to ask themselves whether the key stakeholders have buy-in to this new idea or new change. So there needs to be a lot of communication and engagement, not only with the key stakeholders outside of their audit department, but also within their audit department, right? Because it is their team that has to undergo the most changes. And so they also need to ask whether their team is ready for such a change. And if they're not, you don't abandon the idea. You help them support your team members with the tools or training or changes in processes that will help them make that change more successfully. So one of the key attributes, for example, of Agile is collaboration with key stakeholders. So you need to ask, what type of relationship does internal audit have with the process owners currently, right? If it's not yet a very collaborative relationship, then it will be a larger gap that you have to close. So that is something that you'll need to adapt and make sure that you manage that change very well. I would also caution CAEs to understand where all the gaps are between the current state and desired Agile audit state and how big those gaps are, right? So the bigger the gaps, the more difficult the transformation and also the longer the change. So you need to manage expectations outside of your team as well, to the audit committee, for example, or senior leaders, to help them understand what it will take to get to that change and how long it may take. Having said that, in a year where many companies are facing a resetting of their ways of doing business to address and meet the challenges of all these disruptions, it does seem to provide audit functions with an opportune moment to reset themselves and transform and have an internally driven disruption of the way we approach and conduct audits to adapt to the disrupted world around us.
Great perspective. So what are some of the practices that audit teams could adopt as a first step towards moving to this model?
So the first practice that could be adopted, and it really needs to be adopted first in order to make the other Agile practices effective, is collaboration with key stakeholders. So a lot of older, mature, well-established audit departments who've had decades worth of prior audit programs built up in their work paper files, they tend to make the mistake of becoming complacent. And they've somehow turned their audits into check-the-box exercises over the years, using the same audit programs and just deleting the actual results and then plugging in the current audit results into pre-approved audit programs that are old and need revision and need to be reevaluated. So to properly conduct an Agile audit, you really need to engage the process owners from the planning stages so that you understand what their most important business risks are, what processes have the most impact to addressing those business risks, and what controls within those processes are the key controls to test. The audit clients should be our partners on this audit journey. As partners, the audit team and audit clients, we should all be on the same team tackling the risks together. You also need to update and revise your processes and tools to support Agile audits, because an Agile audit typically is a smaller increment of what was once a traditional audit. The audit cycle will move to a much shorter increment of 1 to 4 weeks maximum. So you really need to have weekly status meetings or even daily, what Agile auditing calls our daily scrum meetings. And they're just 15 minutes long. Rather than before, when at the far end of the extreme, we're meeting with our audit clients at the beginning of the audit for kickoff and then meeting them at the end in order to deliver our results. And that's just simply not enough engagement to understand the business risks of our organization and of our business owners. So finally, we need to change our audit tools. One really great example is the audit report. After so many years of being in the audit industry, I've noticed that some audit departments are still using traditional narratives, very long Word document audit reports, when we really should be moving to a more visual way of presenting our audit results, such as PowerPoint. So those are some examples of practices that you can adapt or adopt in order to move to a more agile way of auditing.
Great advice, Lynn. And as someone who has served as a chief audit executive, would love more advice on what you think internal audit leaders should be focusing on in one of the most challenging years of their lives.
Sure. So some of the most obvious lessons from this very challenging year are, one, we need to be adaptive. We need to be able to pivot quickly. I mean, if we're slow moving, we won't be able to respond to fast moving risk environments in a timely and effective manner, which, if you think about it, it will render us irrelevant to our stakeholders if we're behind on addressing risks that are emerging today. So by implementing Agile audit methodologies, it will address exactly that. It will help us become very adaptive and very nimble. The second lesson I'd like to speak about is we need to understand our audit clients' business risks and focus our efforts on the things that matter most to the organization. You know, if you've been doing audits in a dark corner or in a black box based upon an audit plan that was developed 6 months, 9 months, or 12 months ago, and you're not reevaluating your audit plan on at least a quarterly basis, or even in between quarters, reevaluating to see whether certain risk events need to change our audit plan, then we will eventually become irrelevant to our stakeholders.
Lynn, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing those insights about Agile audits, and particularly leading internal audit during this very challenging era.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm very passionate about this topic, and it's so relevant right now. So if anyone who's interested in learning more can certainly reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to connect with you and discuss your comments or questions further. Thank you again.
Thank you. And to our listeners, thank you for listening to Frazier and Deeter's Culture of Compliance podcast. And please join us for our next episode as we continue to discuss transforming compliance requirements into investments in your business.
Thanks for listening to one of Frazier and Deeter's branded podcasts. To learn more, connect with us on LinkedIn or visit us at FrazierDeeter.com, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode.